Today, we take a look at the real unsung hero in the world of spaceflight, the Gemini Program.
Yeah, too often ignored behind Apollo, but today we're attempting to readdress the balance a little bit.
What was your favorite Gemini moment? Let us know your thoughts at Space and Things 1 on Twitter and at Space and Things Podcast on Instagram and Facebook.
And please do hit the share button if you're enjoying what we're doing right now. But right now, it's time for another episode of the Space and Things Podcast.
You're listening to Space and Things with Dave Giles and Emily Carney.
I'm Dave Giles.
And I'm Emily Carney, and welcome to another episode of Space and Things Podcast. We recorded this a while back just in case we couldn't record another episode for whatever reason, but that doesn't mean we don't think this is a subject worth covering.
Oh, absolutely not. In fact, it's been great knowing that we've had this episode in the bank for when we really needed it, because this week we get to talk about something we absolutely love, the Gemini Program.
The Gemini Program, or the Gemini Program, people do pronounce it differently, I noticed, and that is fine. We're not...
That includes me and you.
Yeah, exactly. Includes us. We're not... There's no particular club of which is right or which is wrong, so we'll just stick to that. So the Gemini Program ran from 1961 and 1966 and was NASA's second human spaceflight program. The obvious upgrade from the Mercury program was the addition of a second astronaut, but the objective of the program was to develop the skills needed for the Apollo program, which had the goal of landing a man on the moon. This included endurance, rendezvous docking, and extravehicular activities or spacewalks.
The two-person capsule was launched on top of a Gemini Titan II rocket, which was just an intercontinental ballistic missile modified to carry the spacecraft. Similar to the Mercury program, the astronauts were literally strapping themselves to the top of a missile. There were two uncrewed missions at the start of the program, Gemini 1, which was an orbital flight which took place in April 1964, and a suborbital mission in January 1965 to test the heat shield. Then followed 10 crewed missions from 23rd of March 1965 to 15th of November 1966. And that will be our focus today. Emily, you may correct me here, the shuttle may have done it, but 10 missions in that time frame is ridiculous, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I think in 1985, I could be wrong because I'm doing this from my memory. I think in 1985, over a year, they flew, I think, 11 missions or so.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
But I think I'm doing this from memory. But the Gemini program, yeah, they flew a ton of missions within less than 2 years, about 18 months, really. And not only that, this was really the time in spaceflight, not just U.S. spaceflight, but just in spaceflight in general, where we really advanced just everything. I mean, they figured out how to rendezvous and dock, and they figured out how to do spacewalks, and they figured out a lot of the stuff we needed to do to get to the moon, which is incredible. I want to say this is the point where we really outpaced the Soviets at the time. I think back then the concern was, how do we know that the Russians aren't beating us, to get to the moon? And I think by Gemini 6 and 7, when there was the rendezvous in space, I think that was the point where it was like we kind of overtook them. I feel like, God, I could talk about this forever. We could have like an 8-hour episode on this. I feel like Gemini is so underrated, and to me, it is like one of the most incredible test programs of all time. I don't think people understand that whole 2 years was really just a sequential steps, and just every mission was like a test flight because they were doing stuff on each mission that just hadn't been done before. And it was just every mission got a little more ambitious. If you look at Gemini 3, it's pretty basic. Let's do a few orbits and try to use a computer to change orbits and stuff like that. Seems pretty basic, but at the time that was a big deal. And then by the next mission, there was a spacewalk. I mean, that to me is like, what? That is like a huge leap into the future almost. I think it's just really cool. And I'm always blown away by the fact that they used a modified ICBM to launch people on it.
Yeah, I know, right? It's crazy. If you're ever in a museum that has both a Mercury capsule and a Gemini capsule, you can see the advancement visibly with your eyes looking in the cockpit. The technology had improved so much in such a short space of time as well. Yeah, I mean, they were designing in Mercury in the late 50s, but the last Mercury mission ended on 63, and then within 2 years, you've got this. And that's just absolutely amazing. So we'll go through this sequentially. You've just mentioned that Gemini 3 there was a short mission. It just did a few orbits and then came down, and it was Gus Grissom and John Young. And this is where we get the first of the records. Gus Grissom becomes the first person to go into space twice. Although his first flight was just suborbital, he still held that accolade, the first person to go into space twice. The Gemini capsule was called the Gusmobile, right? He was so integral in designing it and part of the engineering phase of that. So it was great that he got to go on that first mission.
They did kind of build it around him, which is funny because he was one of the smaller astronauts. He was a little bigger than I am. I've seen some of his clothes and I'm like, oh my God, I could fit into that. That's crazy to me.
Yeah.
I think for Stafford, they had to put like something in there because Stafford was like 6 feet tall. So I think they had to do a modification to get him in there, which is crazy to me because think about being like 6 feet tall and being strapped in there. I'm not a claustrophobic person, but I think I would be like, I don't know. I'm not tall. It's hard for me to imagine tall because I've always been 5'1" most of my life, but very confined spaces. We'll just put it that way.
Yeah, for sure. It's just the Gemini 3 managed 3 orbits. And of course, they got in trouble for the corned beef sandwich, which is an amazing story.
Yes.
Young pulled out a corned beef sandwich to eat. And of course, they then were panicked down on the ground about the crumbs. And it now resides in the Gus Grissom Memorial Museum in his hometown of Mitchell, Indiana. You've been there, right?
You know, I'm embarrassed to admit this. I have not, and I need to.
I thought you did it.
Yeah, they have an event, I think once a year. I don't know if they had it last year because of COVID, and I don't know if they're having it this year, but they usually have an event called the Galactic Gathering, which gathers like Indiana-based astronauts like Joe Allen and Charlie Walker and people like that. And I know that's like part of the event, I think, is the museum, and I would love to go there. I've been meaning to, and I need to fix that.
It's just a small little museum, but it's a great museum. So, let's move on. You're right. You then move on to Gemini 4, which was 2.5 months later, and it's a 4-day mission and includes a spacewalk.
To me, it's crazy because Gemini 4 is when they really started trying to like do things that hadn't really been tried yet. Before the spacewalk, I believe they tried to rendezvous with a spent Gemini stage. Actually, Andy Chaikin gave me the best explanation of this, and I cannot replicate it, but go look up the McDivitt quadrant, and that gives a good explanation of why he wasn't able to rendezvous with the spent Gemini stage. It's not really for lack of skill. His skill, it was more, they hadn't quite worked out orbital mechanics yet. They didn't quite make it, but of course we know that later, McDivitt and company didn't have a problem rendezvousing on Apollo 9.
Absolutely.
They'd figured it out by that point. And it was the first long duration mission, if you consider it that. It's 4 days, but at that time that was a big deal. They didn't know what would happen to them physically, and I talked to Jim McDivitt a few years ago because I was like, how high up were you guys on Gemini 4? Because the photos, it looks like Ed White could just like surf on the surface of the ocean almost. And he was like, we were about 100 miles up. So that mission, even though they didn't meet all their objectives, and I'm not being critical there. I'm just being more like they were really just testing a lot of stuff out and they didn't know a lot of stuff. That was a big leap forward, and like, okay, we did 4 days in space. Now let's do even more time in space. Do
you want to know the other fun fact about that mission? I'm sure you know this already.
Yeah. What is it?
It was the first time that mission control was in Houston.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they moved it. It was in, I believe, Florida, the Mercury Flight Control Center.
And then the next mission, 2.5 months later, they then try and do a whole week. And this was the first ever week-long flight. This was Gemini 5 with Gordon Cooper as the commander and Pete Conrad as the pilot. I can't imagine the two of them together in that tiny capsule. I mean, that must have been fun.
Oh my God. That's an interesting crew. Like, I wouldn't have put them together. They spent 8 days up there. I'm sure by the end, Pete wanted to jump out of there, and just get out of there. But that was the longest long duration mission up to that point.
Yeah, the first time America got a record. Because obviously the Ed White spacewalk wasn't the first spacewalk. It was the first American spacewalk.
Exactly.
But this was the first time where in the space race, America moved ahead slightly, 8 days.
And that was a big deal back then because, this was before Apollo moon missions. This was before Skylab and all that. They had no idea what would happen to people's bodies in space back then. No idea. So it was a big deal. And of course they came back perfectly fine.
When they not just like running on fumes at the end as well? They had like the wrong power or something like that. So they basically turned everything off for the last day. Seemed to be a Gordon Cooper trick. He did the same on his Mercury mission, I think, as well.
I would die. I'd be like, I've had enough. Just get us back home. This is why I'm not an astronaut, because I would have been like, all right, we got no shower up here. Yeah, we all stink. Which brings us to the next missions.
Yeah, exactly. So they called Gemini 5 8 days or bust was what Cooper and Conrad were trying to achieve. But when we skip Gemini 6, and we'll get to that in a moment, Gemini 7 was the next to launch. And this, again, is only a few months later. This now is early December. So August to December. And they go from doing 8 days on Gemini 5 to 14 days. You have Borman as commander, Lovell as the pilot. Ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. Lovell ended up in his pants. Sorry, in his underwear. In UK, we call them pants, obviously. They stripped right down. It was smelly. These Gemini capsules are tiny.
Yeah.
They couldn't go anywhere. And these guys didn't do a spacewalk. So they literally didn't open the doors. They were there 2 weeks. I can't imagine it. I've toured in buses and you get out at the end of your journey or you have stops at service stations and all that kind of stuff. Even that can be horrendous. 2 weeks going nowhere. I can't imagine it. Yeah.
It's usually been compared to being in the cab of like a Volkswagen Beetle or something like that. It's very small interiors. There's a reason why a lot of the earlier astronauts were smaller. So yeah, they had to spend 2 weeks in there, and God bless them for doing that. I think the joke that they both had coming out was they were going to announce that they got engaged, which is hysterical. I love seeing the video of them walking out on the flight deck of the recovery ship. They look like kids with a load in their diaper, like they could barely walk, but that was a success, and it showed that we could go to the moon and back.
The reason why Gemini 7 jumped ahead was because there was a launch failure of Gemini 6, right? And we've talked about this before on the podcast. So Gemini 6 was due to launch, and then it didn't.
Yeah, it just stayed there.
The engine lit and it didn't go anywhere and it shut down straight away. And amazingly, Wally Schirra, who was the commander, did not pull the abort switch, which means they could reload a lot quicker than they would have done if he'd pulled that. And that blows my mind. But the idea of Gemini 6 was it was supposed to be the first rendezvous in space, right? They were targeting an Agena. Is it called Agena? I always say Agena. Is
Agena.
that the right pronunciation? Yeah.
Agena.
Which is a separate rocket that was launching also on a Titan missile. And they were trying to just go and see if they can find it. Can you meet up with another object in space? But the Agena failed as well. So this was supposed to happen in October, and they were trying to figure out how they do it. And they went, well, Gemini 7's going up. Why don't we just try and put both of them up at the same time and have the two of them rendezvous? And as a result of it, the first rendezvous in space was these two crewed spacecraft together. And there's some great photos of them taking photos of each other and holding up little signs.
Yeah.
Wasn't it Go Navy, I think, was or Army Beat Navy or something like that. There was something to do with that.
I think it was Beat Army. Those photos just blow my mind because I'm like, that is so cool that they were able to, rendezvous and really do like some very fine maneuvering around each other. It really showed the maneuverability of the Gemini capsule. It was kind of like the fighter jet of spacecraft. But yeah, they've been dealing with some issues for Gemini 6, and finally they just decided, well, let's just have them rendezvous together so we can kill sort of two objectives.
It's just dawned on me as well that the challenge of having two missions at once, Gemini 6 was only up for 1 day, but that was at the same time. They had two different versions of mission control, one on top of the other, right? I'm assuming they were using both of them at that point, which is it's pretty crazy. And maybe they learned a few things from that about communicating with two different spacecraft at once, which was essential for the moon as well. But that was a brand new thing then. You know, they'd always been able to focus on one, and now they had two different spacecraft up that they had to focus on. I hadn't thought about that being another thing they had to do.
Yeah, having to communicate and control two different or monitor two different spacecraft because, yeah, during Apollo, they also had the same thing. You know, you have the command module and the lunar module, which are separated, you know, after a certain point. So you have to learn how to deal with, you know, integrated spacecraft operations, and then you have to learn how to deal with separate ones, you know. So that was, I think, also a key objective of Gemini was to figure out how to do that in sort of an orderly fashion.
My other fun fact about Gemini 6, Emily, it was the first time musical instruments were played in space.
Yeah, they played jingle bells up there.
Yeah, on a harmonica, which is pretty cool. And some small bells. Yeah, so it was obviously because it was Christmas. I love that.
Yeah, it's a fun thing to listen to.
Right, so then moving on. So that was December. The two missions in December 1965, and then we have 3 months off. Just 3 months off before Gemini 8 when Neil Armstrong and Dave Scott went up. And now they had a 4-day mission planned, but it got cut short because of an emergency. But they still managed to set a record before we'll get on to the emergency. So this was the first time they didn't just rendezvous, they docked with another space vehicle. And this time it was the Agena target vehicle. They absolutely docked with it, which is really, again, you've gone from never doing a rendezvous, struggling to do a rendezvous on Gemini 4 less than a year earlier, to rendezvous in December, to docking in March. I mean, it's crazy how quick this progress went.
Yeah, and Neil Armstrong was the person at the driver's seat for docking it. You know, obviously Scott was helping as well, but everything was going great. And they were excited that the docking had gone so beautifully and stuff, and then all hell breaks loose like an hour later.
So for those who don't know, I'm sure many of you do, you've all probably seen it. It's been in lots of films now. A thruster was stuck, and it caused the spacecraft to topple over, end over end over end, and eventually Armstrong had to turn on the entry thrusters, the re-entry thrusters, in order to get that under control, which means they had to then do an emergency landing, and miles away from where they were supposed to. Took them a long time to get picked up, but the processes worked. He was able to get it under control, and the emergency processes actually worked, which is really important. And I suppose that was obviously another key function that they didn't intend to figure out, but they did, which is good, I suppose.
Yeah, management of the first emergency in space, which I wish it, I mean, obviously, I'm sure nobody there wished it had happened, you know, but I think Dave Scott said something once, and not to take away from Dave's role during that mission at all, but he said something like once, like, I was very lucky to be flying with Armstrong that day. It's been speculated that, you know, Armstrong's thinking may have contributed to him being considered for the first lunar landing because he was so quick thinking, very calm. He just got him out of that. Another fun fact is I believe Scott was supposed to do an EVA during that mission as well, and he was supposed to wear sort of like a jetpack as well, sort of like a kind of like a, I think the AMU, if I'm not mistaken. I've seen pictures of him practicing with it, but we'll never know if it would have worked or not because it did not happen. But don't worry, Dave Scott gets to do some EVAs later in his career, so that's okay.
Yeah, he's all right.
He's okay.
He's all right. Do you know the other thing that I always think that Gemini 8 highlights is the communication situation at that time.
Yeah.
When they started spinning, they couldn't communicate with Houston. They were on their own. They had no communication with the ground. They were on their own. They then ended up back in a communication area. And you forget that with all of this. And I know this went right up to mid-80s. They sorted that out. It was in the 90s before they had TDRS go up.
They still had ground stations in the 80s.
So yeah, you had blind areas, blind spots where you couldn't communicate.
Yeah, and even during Skylab, like, I always have to tell myself when I talk to, like, people, of course I mentioned Skylab in a Gemini episode, right?
Why wouldn't you?
Why wouldn't I? But yeah, even during the Skylab program, you think, well, it's almost, you know, almost a decade later, you know, it's probably 7 or 8 years later. They were still very much restricted by ground stations. You know, they had to wait to get into a certain area to talk to ground control about stuff, you know, and I don't know if I'd say primitive, but yeah, we were limited by communications for a really long time.
Okay, Gemini 8, we have TM solid. You're looking good on the ground. Go ahead and dock.
Moving on, just a few months later, you got Gemini 9. And I think Gemini 9 is the only one that didn't set any records, I think. I may have that wrong.
Yeah, Cernan did a spacewalk from hell, and I believe they did rendezvous with a Gemini vehicle, but the payload shroud did not come off, so you have the angry alligator picture. So that was kind of a frustrating mission in a lot of ways, and unfortunately, it has kind of a tragic backstory because the original crew, C and Bassett, died in a plane crash, which is horrible, and I won't get too much into it. It's really a very sad story. They got rotated to Prime, Stafford and Cernan, and they did have a successful mission, but if you read The Last Man on the Moon and watch the documentary Last Man on the Moon, I'm not somebody who freaks out easily, but I was like feeling panic during the parts when he was talking about the spacewalk. I could feel it in my chest. I was like, oh my God. That's not a criticism of Cernan in any way. They just
didn't know what they were doing.
Yeah, they hadn't figured out how to train for EVAs yet. If you look at a lot of the early footage of EVA training for Gemini, they're doing it on the ground, or they're doing it on zero-G planes, and we'll find out later that that's really not the optimal environment for training people on how to do spacewalks.
I guess the record they had is probably the first backup crew stepping into it as a prime crew.
Yes.
They probably don't want to be that record, but alas, they are.
Yeah.
I tell you what I like about what they've done at Kennedy Space Center, where the capsule is. I like that when you look at it through a window, they've got a hologram of Gene floating around it, and they go into the struggles he had, and they have a little hologram Gene talking through it as well. And then you walk around the other side and you just see it normally. But that's a really cool exhibit of explaining exactly what that spacecraft was used for and the struggles they had on that mission. I thought it was a really good exhibit. That's in the Astronaut Hall of Fame at Kennedy Space Center.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a nice little exhibit they got there.
Then 6 weeks later, we have Gemini 10. Again, this timescale is crazy. And John Young takes command, and he's got Mike Collins joining him.
Right? That's like the dream crew of all time. Like, there are dream crews, and then I'm like, they put Young and Collins together. That's like, oh my God. Like, that's a poster. Like, that's a poster on a bedroom wall right there. That was a freaking incredible mission, and nobody talks about it.
Agreed.
Why? There should be like whole books dedicated to it. First of all, they rendezvoused with two different spacecraft, the Agena vehicle, and they rendezvoused with Gemini 9s, or not Gemini 9, I'm sorry, Gemini 8s.
Gemini 8.
Yeah, they didn't dock with the Gemini 8 target vehicle, but they rendezvoused with it. And I believe Mike Collins, while they were docked to their target vehicle, he did a fairly useful EVA. I think he did get kind of exhausted, but it wasn't as bad as the previous EVA, but they still had a lot to learn.
What I like about this is he's the first person to transfer from one space vehicle to another space vehicle, because he jumped across from Gemini to the Agena, what they had docked to. So, he got a record there. That was a first. But also, they were the first the Agena used its own engine to change their speed, which is the first time that had happened as well. They docked, and the Agena then pushed them the other way, which is really quite something as well.
There are pictures of that, and they're really cool to look at even to this day. I mean, they look like something from the future, but it's from the mid-'60s, so it's really cool. I love it in the movie Apollo 11. Of course, Mike Collins would later fly as command module pilot on Apollo 11. You know the little vignettes they have when they introduce the astronauts?
Yeah.
And they show Mike on Gemini 10. I'm like, I love how they sort of set the scene like, this is what he did before. And I'm like, I love that little part in the film. That's so cool. But yeah, there needs to be a whole movie about Gemini 10. Just, I'm sorry. I don't know why. I love that mission. I love that they put Young and Collins together. You wouldn't think that works out because Young is very quiet and sort of taciturn. And Collins, of course, is Mike Collins. But it worked out beautifully. I mean, a very, very awesome mission. I love all of the Gemini missions, mainly because I just think that era was so exciting because they did so much during that time. But that mission is just so damn cool. That's all I gotta say.
2 months later, and once again, we're onto this short timeline again. Gemini 11 takes off with Pete Conrad now in command with his buddy Dick Gordon as the pilot. A 3-day mission, and it still holds a record. So this is the only one that still has a current record. The altitude with the apogee of 739.2 nautical miles, which is still the highest apogee of an orbiting spacecraft with humans on it to this day, which is quite something.
Until possibly later this year.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. I think we'll talk about that later on.
Let's talk about it later.
Right.
Yeah.
That was a successful mission. They used the Gina that they're docked to boost their apogee that high. And Dick Gordon also did a 33-minute EVA and 2-hour stand-up EVA, so 2 EVAs as well, which is quite something. That often gets ignored.
Yeah, he did get an EVA in his career, which is nice. But it was still a challenge for him. And not to criticize Dick Gordon, but they weren't training right for EVAs at that point, because they just didn't know how to until the next mission.
And now we'll get onto it. The final crewed Gemini mission, or the final mission of the Gemini program, which took place on the 11th to the 15th of November, 1966. It was a 4-day mission. And Jim Lovell was commanding, and Buzz Aldrin was pilot. They rendezvoused and docked with an Agena, and they kept station with it. And they did that manually as well. Buzz was Dr. Rendezvous, as he loves being called.
Yes.
Apparently he would bore you to tears with talking about rendezvous at a party and how to do it. But yeah, he used a sextant, the old ways of doing things, and they managed to get them to rendezvous.
Yeah, there's some really cool pictures from that mission. I think he had a beat Army sign or something while he was doing the EVA. No, he didn't have a beat Army sign. He had a beat Navy sign because he's in the Air Force. My bad. I knew he did something to piss off the Navy. Yeah. Thanks, Buzz.
Lovell would have loved that.
Yeah, right? I would have left his ass out there. I would have been like, see ya, cutting you off. But no, I'm kidding. But I'm not kidding, actually. But nah. But say what you want to say about him. Buzz Aldrin is incredibly intelligent. He's one of the people who figured out that really the optimal way to train for EVAs would be in the water with the neutral buoyancy. So they assembled a tank and stuff, and that's how he trained for that EVA. And once he got into space, he found out that worked remarkably well, and that really became the gold standard for EVAs for pretty much the rest of NASA's history. Even nowadays, that's kind of become a gold standard since Gemini 12, which really, showed that if we use this training technique of neutral buoyancy, we can have people trained enough that they know how to react, and they can research and develop how to better do spacewalks.
And I mean, they didn't just prove this; they smashed it.
Absolutely.
You go from some small EVAs to this one, which was 5 hours and 30 minutes.
Yeah,
he was outside and was fine. Whereas you think of Gene Cernan's Gemini 9 spacewalk, which was a nightmare, and he wasn't outside for that long. It was 2 hours.
Yeah.
And he was exhausted. And then 5 hours 30, and Buzz was absolutely fine.
Yeah.
And achieved all of his objectives. I mean, that's really quite something. There's a massive difference there in just 6 months as well, June to November.
Yeah.
5 months.
And you think about it, less than 2 years earlier, there'd never been an EVA before. Ever.
Yeah, exactly.
No EVAs.
Yeah.
And Ed White's first EVA, if you watch the film of it, it's very simple. He's out there not very long, and he's
hanging out.
He's not doing any experiments. He's not doing anything, he's not doing anything outside of the spacecraft. He's not doing maintenance. He's basically just testing it. He basically goes out and comes back in. I think he tried using that zip gun he had, the thruster gun, but it didn't work well. Basically, at the Gemini program, they just started out like, okay, we're just going to go outside and see what happens. And then it went to, in less than 2 years, you had somebody out there for 5 hours.
And achieving things as well, actually getting things done.
Yeah, so Gemini was really... it's hard to sum it up for me because I love it so much. There is an excellent NASA book about the Gemini program, and it has an amazing title. I'm sure you've read it, Dave. It's called On the Shoulder of Titans.
Yeah, great name.
That is like the best book ever, title ever. And I know that David Shaler and Colin Burgess have probably written about it a lot. But other than that, I can't think of, and I might be missing something, I can't think of any non-space history like mainstream authors Andy Chaikin wrote about it a little bit in The Man on the Moon, but more kind of to introduce you to Apollo, you know? But I can't think of, a lot of mainstream books that really talk about that program, you know? And it's sad because to me, that's like one of the best test programs of all time because you just, oh my God. Now people are going to be like, Emily, just shut up. But I was talking to Al Warden once, as you do, you know? I was talking to Al Warden a few years back, and he was talking about, you know, people don't talk about Gemini program, but it was really one of the most ambitious test programs of all time because every mission had a milestone you had to achieve to get to the next step. And I never really thought about it like that before. And the way I look at Gemini, Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo now is I look at them all as test missions. Because they were really just going from one thing, like even like the later Apollo missions, if you look at 15, okay, we can drive a moon car. 16, we can drive a moon car for a bit longer. And 17, we drove it the longest. You know, it really changed my sort of how I thought about those programs. It just, you know, one long test program, but it's almost like science fiction to me that they achieved all those things in the mid 1960s because you look at, you know, computers back then were nothing. Yeah. For the time they were sophisticated. Yeah, I think Gemini also was the first spacecraft with a computer on it. I don't think it was a digital computer, but I think it was the first spacecraft that had a computer. Yeah, I'm done blathering on. I think I just I just love this program so much.
It's also a beautiful rocket as well. It just looks so great. I love it.
Yeah, if you've been to Kennedy Space Center and you've seen the Gemini Titan II rocket, it's just gorgeous. When the sun hits it, it's like shiny and stuff. It's very aesthetically pleasing. I've never talked to anybody about the ride on it, but I've been told it was a sporty ride. 5 minutes to orbit and it's a missile.
There's a whole other episode we're going to do about what could have happened to the Gemini program and what could have happened to the Gemini spacecraft, how it could have been developed. There were plans made, it just didn't happen. And I think it's possibly some of the great lost space programs are definitely what could have happened with Gemini. I think that's another aspect which we're definitely going to have to cover at another time, Emily, because I think it's really important.
Yeah, we need to discuss it because Gemini was really a versatile little vehicle. It was very maneuverable and they had plans for it beyond, you know, the 2-year program. And I feel like it's almost a shame that it wasn't utilized for other things because we laugh about, oh, it was really tiny inside, but it really could have done a lot of work.
Talking of the rocket, by the way, there's a beautiful, I think it's a replica at the Kansas Cosmosphere. And they've got it kind of on a launch pad and you can stand underneath it. It's really cool.
Awesome.
It's a really cool exhibit. If you ever get down there, that's definitely worth checking out. Anyway, I hope people have got a bit of our excitement for this program because it really is just the best.
The best. Gemini Titan 2 had the best launch startup sound ever in the world, too.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Amazing sound.
My favorite part in the movie First Man is the Gemini launch because I'm sitting there and I'm like, oh my God, they got it right. Awesome.
Yeah. And obviously, as we mentioned earlier, we'll briefly bring it up now. That one record that Gemini still has active at the moment, the Apogee record, may get beaten later this year with the Polaris program, which we mentioned briefly when it was announced. Jared Isaacman, who was the commander of and the guy who purchased the inspiration for SpaceX Dragon capsule and made that mission happen, is at it again, and he's got another mission going up. And that was a high orbit. I think that was one of the highest orbits since Gemini 11, but this time he wants to beat it. He wants to get higher than they did on Gemini. So even now, you know, that would be coming up to 56 years later, that record is finally going to hopefully get beaten.
Right? I think Pete and Dick would be happy to see it getting beaten, honestly. I think they would be like, well, it's about time that somebody did it. I think during that mission, they're going to try to do an EVA as well, and SpaceX is actually designing EVA suits. And it's really cool because in the Polaris mission and some of their like literature and some of their marketing on social media, their branding, they've referenced the Gemini program, and I couldn't be happier about that. I think that's marvelous.
Yeah, I agree. It's a great thing that they've got coming up. I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, I'm out. Okay, you're down. Smoke free. Okay, I'm coming over. Okay, stand on. See me here? Oh, there you are. You're nice and cut, Ed. You look beautiful. I feel like $1 million. I'm a good guy. Young man. This is the greatest experience I've just remembered.
So that's it for this week. Hopefully, whatever stopped us from doing the podcast normally this week will be resolved by next week. Most likely, I'll be back from another holiday, which I seem to have. And we'll be back with a full update on all the news from the world of spaceflight. But we hope you enjoyed our look at the Gemini program.
Yes, and thank you to those who continue to hit the share button. The free marketing is massively appreciated as we still have not figured out a marketing budget. So
nope.
It's zero, by the way. Anyway, don't forget, in space, no one can hear you mean.
Space and Things has been brought to you by And Things Productions.